which is really important movement history. So I'm going to begin the recording now, and then I'll introduce DA and Pat. All right, so you've been warned. Okay, so today we are really excited to be here with the authors of a book called To Offer Compassion, which is a history of the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. And our speakers are DA Dirks, who, if you want to wave your hand, DA, there you go. So DA, who uses they, them pronouns, is the executive director of the University of Virginia Pride Center for Sexuality and Gender Diversity. DA was diagnosed with young onset Parkinson's disease in 2017 and is navigating the challenges of living with a chronic illness. When not working for Liberation, DA runs with friends and rescues cats, but not simultaneously. I really like that bio. So welcome, DA. And Patricia A. Relf, or Pat, who uses she, her pronouns, is a freelance writer based in Cleveland Heights, Ohio. She has written children's and educational books and software, taught Latin, and worked in publishing. She is known to her grandchildren as Saki, and she is a member of GER. And so now I'm going to hand it off to our wonderful speakers, and we'll have some time for questions and answers. Thanks, y'all.
Great. So I guess I will launch in a little bit here. I just wanted to mention that I am in British Columbia. I am in the East Kootenays, which is unceded territory of the K2 Naha people. You can see sort of my background here. There are many, many trees. Hopefully the internet seems stable and solid and I won't disappear. That is my hope today. I should just say that I actually just left that job at the University of Regina, in part because of my Parkinson's. It was a very stressful job, and it was not interacting well with my Parkinson's. So I'm going to take a little bit of a break before I launch maybe back into doing equity work, equity, diversity, and inclusion work, which I've done for many years, both for nonprofits, business, and higher education. So, but I think I'm going to take a little break. Pat, did you want to just say hi and maybe give a little overview of what we're going to be doing today before I really launch us in?
Yeah, sure. DA and I met when we both lived in Michigan. We were at Western Michigan University in grad school together at different stages in our lives. And so that's how we came to be working on this project together. I was on the board of Planned Parenthood in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and heard about this group through an event that they had. And I had never heard of it before, in spite of the fact that I was alive at the time and perfectly well aware of the abortion situation. I had never heard of the group, and in spite of the fact that I was a Presbyterian and there were plenty of Presbyterians part of it, never heard of it. So that's how we got started. DA just asked, do we know anything about this group? Has anything been written about it? And not a lot had. So that's how we got started on this. And we want to tell you the story of the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion in short, as best we can, and kind of connect it to what's going on now. So hand off to DA.
In short, the 15 years that we spent researching and interviewing for this book, every time I flip through it to remind myself that we did this, I'm like, we did that. We actually did this. It seemed for a long time like this was just a thing that we were doing in our spare time to spend time together and just to like have this weird hobby of interviewing elderly clergy. But it has turned into a book, so we're happy about that. So you're going to hear a few names today, but you will probably most frequently hear the name of the Reverend Howard Moody and probably the great Arlene Carmen, who we will talk about at greater length. But the reason we called this book To Offer Compassion, it came from a quote in an interview that Howard Moody gave, in which he talked about the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. Their purpose was to, quote, not to encourage abortions, but to offer compassion and to increase the freedom of women with problem pregnancies. And so we felt like To Offer Compassion seemed like a good title for our book. And so I'm going to start today just talking a little bit about a quick background and the context of the 1960s and abortion access. And I think, as Pat maybe said earlier, if folks were not yet on the call, this is a group who probably knows this history best and has lived through aspects of this history in their own time and life. And I just want to say, I'm going to mention a couple of things that may be content or trigger warning for folks, and if you yourself had to access an illegal abortion or had to self-induce an abortion, this might bring up some feelings and emotions for you. And so just take care of yourself if that's the case as we talk about this today. What was it like in the 1950s and 1960s for access for women to have abortions? Well, usually it was a hospital procedure that you had to meet with a committee in order to get access to an abortion. And mostly this was affluent white women who could potentially access this service. The Reverend Howard Moody had understood through counseling women in the 1950s and 60s that there was that women who had to undergo access to illegal abortions. It was frightening and risky for these women to undertake these illegal abortions. But many women didn't have any other choice. And so the only justification for illegal abortion during this time period was that it was a threat to the woman's life. And these legal therapeutic abortions were available only in hospitals, generally only after a committee of physicians, who were usually men, ruled on whether to allow the procedure. Some required women actually appearing before the full committee for questioning, which was a demeaning experience that discouraged women from applying. The process could involve repeated physical examinations. Women who applied for abortion on psychiatric grounds sometimes studied psych texts in order to feign symptoms and answer the board's questions correctly. Many abortions were proved contingent on the woman undergoing sterilization at the same time. This requirement was particularly applied to Black women and women of color. This process was time-consuming, and a pregnancy was obviously progressing as this process was undergoing. Additionally, again, the patient usually had to be well off enough to pay doctor and lab fees for the procedure and hospital bills for an overnight or longer stay. And hospitals were reluctant to provide the service at all, and some limited the number of abortions they would permit. In the 1960s, US hospitals provided only about 8,000 abortions a year out of more than 1 million abortions being performed annually. So it was this was a Planned Parenthood estimate, so it was a fraction of the abortions actually that were happening. Most women, and again, particularly those women who were poor, who were women of color, who were Black women, were at the mercy of a shadowy underground system that was terrifying and, again, humiliating and demeaning, and could be, in fact, dangerous. Most practitioners were not licensed physicians, much less gynecologists who were doing this. And they usually included dangerous methods, unhygienic practices, and contacting the abortionist usually meant meeting someone in person, requiring some furtive maneuvers, being blindfolded, not knowing the location to which women were being taken. They had to go alone and often faced terrifying ordeals when they arrived at the location. The other alternative to this was women undertaking their own abortions, often with tragic consequences, which could lead to death. And in fact, deaths from botched abortions, including self-induced ones, were estimated at 5,000 a year in the US in the early 1960s, although it was probably much higher, but not reported. And they accounted for half of all the childbearing deaths in New York City. Those who died were disproportionately women of color. 80% of women who died from bad abortions in New York City in the 1960s were Black or Puerto Rican. And again, some women chose to end their own lives if they found out that they were pregnant and could not get access to an abortion. So there were many deaths at the hands of either bad abortionists or self-harm during this time period. So that's a little bit of the terrible history. And then physicians who were licensed were often not that helpful to women. The American Medical Association tended to be quite conservative. and were involved with pushing in the mid to late 1800s, pushing for abortion to be outlawed in states. And so the physicians themselves were not that helpful. Part of it was that physicians who were predominantly men wanted to have higher professional status than other practitioners, particularly midwives, nearly all women. And midwives were traditionally performed abortions, right? And so it was about professionalization, but it was also about male power. And so by 1900, abortion at any stage of a pregnancy had been made illegal in every state except to save a woman's life. I just wanted to parenthetically say, again, looking particularly at Black women, the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which was founded in 1896, supported the establishment of family planning clinics and opposed the coerced or forced sterilization of Black women. Black newspapers of the 1930s and 1940s reported the mortality rates of women who had septic abortions, and Loretta J. Ross cites a survey of Black women by a doctor in Nashville in 1940 who found 28% of women had obtained at least one abortion. At the same time, abortion providers were becoming more stigmatized within the medical profession, and safe abortions performed by licensed physicians became less and less available, particularly to poor women, women of color, and Black women. So that's a little bit about the difficulties that the medical practice and the profession put in front of women. I just wanted to briefly also mention what was happening legally in the 50s and 60s. There was the American Law Institute, or ALI, developed wording for a model statute in 1959 that would permit licensed physicians to terminate a pregnancy for reasons that included risk of serious harm to the physical or mental health of the mother, risk of serious birth defects, or if the pregnancy was the result of rape or incest. And so this proposal was one that would liberalize the circumstances within which women could seek abortions, which then also left physicians in control ultimately. So that was the ALI proposed law that was put forth in 1959. By 1962, we have the thalidomide crisis forthcoming. That is a drug that was known to cause birth defects, and so some women were trying to access abortions who had taken thalidomide. Most famously, Sherry Finkbein, who was the host of Romper Room, which gained a lot of public attention. And also in 1964 and 65, a rubella epidemic broke out in the US, which could cause miscarriage or serious problems such as blindness, deafness, heart defects, developmental disabilities in a fetus. And so again, women wanting access to abortions, both due to thalidomide and rubella. So it was in the public consciousness at that time. I think that's really what I wanted to say initially. And then I was going to just pass it along to Pat, and she'll just fill in anything that I forgot about.
No, I was just going to go on to how the Clergy Consultation Service actually got started in that milieu. There were groups that were getting together to try to reform state laws in various states, including New York. And in the mid-1960s in New York City, there was an existing small group of an ecumenical group of liberal ministers and rabbis who used to meet at Washington Square Methodist Church in Greenwich Village to discuss topics of social justice. Of course, almost all of the members of this group were men, because at that time, most ordained clergy were men. Women did go to seminary, but most became educators or they were ministers of music. Not too many parish ministers, for example, were women, though there was at least one, maybe two women who were part of this ecumenical group. Anyway, only a few of these clergy knew anything much about abortion at that time. As we said, Reverend Howard Moody of Judson Memorial Church, who was an American Baptist, had actually had his first abortion counseling experience in 1957. A church member had asked him to accompany her to a house in New Jersey for her abortion. She was just nervous about it. So they went, and when a woman answered the door that they were told to go to, and she saw that there was a man with the patient, she just slammed the door in their faces. So that left Howard Moody to try to find a doctor, which he did, who would do the abortion. And he did continue to make the occasional referral. But for most of the clergy, this was a whole new topic. They didn't know much about abortion counseling. In New York State in 1966, there was a big push to reform the state abortion law. And at that time, of course, it was generally Republicans who were trying to deregulate abortion, mostly because they wanted doctors to have the freedom to practice as they chose and not be regulated, not really on behalf of women's rights, but nonetheless, Democrats were often against reform. So a bill was introduced in the state legislature, but failed. Then in early 1967, another reform bill came through, and the clergy in this group really were hoping that that would pass. When it too failed, they realized they probably needed to do more than just, speak up. They needed to act. A friend to several of the ministers was the author Larry Lader, who was later one of the founders of NARAL. And he had written a book in 1966 called Abortion. It was widely read, and in fact, it was excerpted, if you can imagine this now, it was excerpted in Reader's Digest. So as a result, Larry Lader received a constant stream of letters and phone calls begging him for referrals to doctors who were willing to perform abortions. And he did give many referrals, but it was overwhelming. It was really too much for one person to do. So since Lader knew Moody and several others in this clergy group, he started to push them, and apparently he pushed them hard to start offering abortion referrals themselves. The clergy actually were willing to do that, but they figured they really needed to educate themselves first. So they started meeting with doctors so they could learn how abortions were done. They met with women who had had abortions to hear about their experience. And they met with lawyers from the NYCLU for legal advice. And they came up with a set of rules. They would refer out of state to confuse the jurisdiction. They would counsel only in person, never by phone or letter. The members of the group would be clergy only. They were hoping their status as confidential counselors would be a legal protection for them. They decided not to appear clandestine. They didn't want to be in any way underground. And so they objected to being called something like an underground railroad or whatnot. They wanted to be open about it and appear that it was just part of their normal pastoral care duties. No money was to change hands, and they would refer only to licensed physicians who had been checked out by women. So that brings us to one of our heroes, Arlene Carmen. Arlene was a longtime activist in New York City who became the administrator at Judson Church in 1967. She herself was Jewish. As the Clergy Consultation Service began its work, she also became the administrator of that group and much more. And I really have to read to you a little bit of what she said about what she did. She took on the job of maintaining connections with doctors, from checking on their credentials, offices, and bedside manner, to arranging how women were to contact them, to negotiating prices. She would do no counseling herself. With this strict division of labor, they hoped conspiracy among the clergy, client, and abortion provider would be difficult to prove. Carmen headed a women's committee to find and evaluate doctors. She and others took tremendous personal risks to ensure that the doctors used by the Clergy Consultation Service, which we also for short called the CCS, were capable practitioners and respectful to patients, visiting them in person, usually posing as a pregnant woman in search of an abortion. When Carmen posed as a potential patient, she was sometimes in the examining room on a table with her feet in stirrups before she revealed her real mission and proffered a letter from the clergy. She later told interviewer Ellen Chesler, "I went through all the steps short of having an actual abortion before I would make it clear that I was not there for that purpose. Often, I never got that far because something about the situation was so appalling. I knew immediately that it was not a situation I thought we could refer women to. If an office was very filthy, for example, or if the doctor was very crude, unpleasant, God knows what. So she was our hero. So I'll hand back to Doe to talk about.
I sort of see Arlene as like Superwoman. You know, she's like in the stirrups and then she's like, ta-da, I'm here for other purposes and you have passed the test. So the group launched officially on May 22nd, 1967 with a piece in the New York Times, again, because they wanted to be public and above board about what they were doing. And Howard Moody, the Reverend Howard Moody, was the designated spokesperson, again, so that there would be a consistent message put forth and there wouldn't be any confusion with, you know, a bunch of different people making public statements on behalf of the group. So the procedure was that Judson Memorial was to be the administrative center. Excuse me, I have a frog in my throat. And Judson was housed at that time the group's answering machine. I'm sure we all remember the era of answering machines. The machine would give the names and telephone numbers of the clergy who were on call to work that week. And there would be, again, a few rabbis, mostly Protestant clergy on call. And then the group, you know, debated a little bit about what they were to call themselves. There was pregnancy was thrown around for a while and was used in some locations. But Moody himself said it was important to use the word abortion. At that time, it was not used in public discourse. The aim was to normalize the word. So the group became the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion. And the group wrote a statement of purpose that goes on at length, but it began by saying, quote, "The present abortion laws require over 1 million women in the United States each year to seek illegal abortions, which often cause severe mental anguish, physical suffering, and unnecessary death of women." And so again, the clergy found that this was offensive to them, lacking in compassion, and they therefore stated that this was going to now become part of their pastoral counseling duties. So the launch happened on May 22nd, 1967. The answering machine was set up at Judson, and there was, guess what, a deluge of calls immediately came through. They were a bit surprised by the magnitude of the response. When the CCS was, again, was inundated with calls, often coming from across the country. And there were some clergy who reached out wanting to set up services in their own regions, and Pat will talk about the expansion of the group. Again, the CCS knew that they wanted to refer women to licensed physicians, but they also knew sometimes they would have to refer women to illegal abortions in order to get women access. Public response was mostly positive. Their press reaction was either neutral or positive. So, you know, the group was launched. There was an inundation of desire and demand from women from across the country. What they found was early on, they were doing some referrals out of country to places like Puerto Rico or England, obviously, which was very expensive and hard to access for many women. And Canada was also a place that some women were referred to after Canada decriminalized abortion in 1969. But as Pat said, mostly it was across state lines for women in order to confuse the criminal process if that was going to happen. I think that's what I wanted to cover, and now I'm going to throw it back over to Pat.
Yes, as DA said, right away, they were inundated with calls from women around the country. And since they were committed to counseling only in person, they couldn't help most of those women. So women did come from out of state sometimes to be counseled, but clearly they needed to expand. So the New York City members reached out to clergy they knew in other states. Moody, for example, reached out to fellow Baptists to start groups in Philadelphia and Chicago. And then they recruited like-minded clergy in their areas. Often their connections had been made through civil rights work anti-war work or poverty work, and the same clergy who were willing to stand up on those issues were usually the ones who were willing to do abortion counseling. Campus clergy were also usually easy to recruit. In other cases, clergy from out of state heard of the group and called Moody to find out how they could start a chapter in their area. One of those was Reverend Hugh Anwell, who was a UCC minister, and he and Liz Canfield were part of a Los Angeles group, one of these groups that was working to reform the abortion law in California. They contacted Moody and then visited New York for training. Otherwise, Moody and Carmen often traveled elsewhere to train new groups. They'd call a batch of recruits together and they'd give their pitch. And then a certain core group of people would agree to do the work. Most mainline denominations of clergy were represented. So in about this order, it was Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, Episcopalian, UCC or Congregational, Unitarian, Lutheran, Reformed Jewish, and others. And the others did actually include some Roman Catholic priests and nuns who generally didn't do referrals, but they were willing to be available for post-abortion counseling for Catholic women. So from her office at Judson Church, Arlene Carmen administered the national group, and I would have to say with an iron hand. She was apparently quite a retiring person in person, but on behalf of this work, she was quite fierce. She managed the referral list of approved doctors, dropping doctors from the list if she received bad reports from them. And she even kept a negative list of dangerous abortionists. So she also kept the clergy counselors in line and made sure they followed the guidelines that had been set up by the group. So how many counselors were eventually part of the network? Arlene Carmen herself gave the number 3,000. And we don't have any reason to doubt that figure because we have found the names of more than half that many. And every time we speak, we hear about more people. We keep hearing of more clergy who were part of it. And in fact, eventually not all the counselors were clergy. In some states, there were some chapters recruited social workers, nurses, and other non-clergy counselors. A friend of mine who was a social worker in Michigan was recruited as part of the group. And in Missouri, in fact, it was a nurse who actually started the Clergy Consultation Service chapter. So
it's me now. I'm talking a little bit about how the CCS was. As we did our research, we came to think of them as a radical feminist populist group, though they were predominantly white middle-class clergy, surprisingly. So we know the 1960s gave rise to many radical movements and many feminist groups. The Clergy Consultation Service on abortion was, we think, pretty unique. Should I modify unique? They were unique, period. It was overwhelmingly a white, male, middle-aged, middle and upper class group of mainline Protestant and Jewish clergy. But it was also radical, feminist, and populist in that it was radical. It sought to overthrow existing abortion laws, not reform them, but overthrow them. Feminist in that it worked to return women's power over their own reproductive choice and bodies. And populist in that it strove to serve women of every socioeconomic status, race, and religion. And so that we felt was quite unique. They saw their clerical status as useful to women's fight for abortion rights, even if most of them were men, just as many of the same clergy had found their status useful in the civil rights struggle, even if they were white. And so we mentioned a little bit about the fact that there were few ordained women at the time, right? That was just the way that churches worked as patriarchal institutions. and the clergy were definitely aware of this, the male clergy, right? They felt the lack of women participants. And so they made special efforts to recruit women counselors, whether they be clergy or lay people. And so, you know, Pat alluded to that a little bit when she discussed that. So I wanted to talk a little bit more about the work that the clergy did around abortion law reform. Just very briefly. Moody again said, I love this quote from Howard Moody, "Reform is the enemy of real social change." So he really wanted to repeal the existing abortion law at the time. And that was what the group was focusing on at the time. And so that was happening particularly with the New York law, but that was going on in New Jersey and California, Michigan. Many of the CCS leaders were actively trying to work to repeal abortion laws in their respective states. You know, Moody and the other clergy were acutely aware of their own power and privilege as men with collars, particularly at that time period in the 1960s when mainline religions were still sort of culturally more powerful and respected at the time. And so Moody said, in fact, "We were the only ones doing anything about abortion, the clergy. We would report to the health committee our findings. That was impressive to them, that it was mothers and daughters and wives of middle-class people who were seeking abortions. I'm telling you, it's the middle-class thing that really changed it. I don't believe it for a moment. If we had only been poor people we were serving, a change in New York state law wouldn't have happened." So it was the information that the CCS was presenting also, which kind of galvanized lawmakers in several states. I wanted to just briefly also talk about the we found a lack of Black clergy who were involved in the CCS. And there was there's some historical reasons as to why this was. Loretta Ross, who we mentioned earlier, talked about the majority of abortions available to Black women in the 50s and 60s were provided by doctors and midwives operating illegally. Few Black clergy joined the CCS because there was a suspicion that existed then and continues today, Black people have against the white medical establishment, which historically did not do great things for Black communities. We can talk about things like Dr. James Marion Sims' experimentation on enslaved women and children, the eugenics movement, which was racist, and the Tuskegee experiments that began in the 30s and continued until 1972, in which Black men believed they were receiving treatment for syphilis, but in fact were not. So there were lots of reasons that the Black community at large had suspicions against the white medical establishment. And we mentioned Black women were more likely to undergo forced sterilization than were white women. So this led to, you know, a division between the Black and white communities around medical treatment and care. The Black Panther Party was the nationalist group who supported abortions and contraception, although not without controversy within its own ranks, again, based on gender. Women wanted access to this, men often did not support that. So we know this was happening at the time. We do know that some of the women who sought abortions, as we mentioned, were women of color. Black women accessed the service. I did want to just mention, C. Eric Lincoln points out in The Black Church Since Fraser that while there was some coming together of white and Black clergy at the height of the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam became the major competitor for the interests of white activists subsequently. And we found evidence from our own sample of CCS clergy, in fact. The segregation of mainline Protestant churches and majority Black serving churches we see as a legacy from the history of slavery and institutionalized racism in the US that was not overcome by the civil rights movement and is reflected by the lack of participation by Black clergy in the CCS. And anecdotally, a side note, if you're interested in the history of the Black church, Dr. Henry Louis Gates Jr. recently did a 2-part PBS special on the history of the Black church in the US, if you're interested in seeing that. I think that's what I wanted to say before I pass it back over to Pat.
Well, at this point, you might be wondering, they were doing something illegal, these clergy counselors, did they actually face legal repercussions? And surprisingly, not much. The day the clergy announced their work on the front page of the New York Times, they all expected to hear a knock on their door from the authorities, but that never happened. The police and prosecutors generally left the group alone because they were preventing so many tragedies. The police and so forth were dealing all the time with the outcomes of bad abortions. And in fact, many of the clergy we talked to remembered referring family members or girlfriends of police officers and judges. However, 3 counselors out of 3,000 or more did get caught up in investigations of doctors. It seemed the primary investigation was of the doctors. And 2 of them were actually charged with a crime for their work. So let me just tell you about one of them, who was located where I am now in Cleveland, Ohio. The head of the Cleveland chapter, Reverend Farley Wheelwright, a Unitarian minister here, had found a doctor in Massachusetts who had received good reports from women. But what Wheelwright did not know was that this doctor, Dr. Pierre Brunel, had actually lost his license in Massachusetts and was being watched by the police. One night in April 1969, a Cleveland woman was starting to drive home from Dr. Brunel's office when she suffered severe cramps and stopped, as it happened, at a police station for help. The police questioned her, of course, because that's what you do when somebody's suffering, I suppose. And she told them everything, including that she had been referred by a member of the Cleveland Clergy Consultation Service. However, Wheelwright didn't know anything about this police involvement until a couple of months later, when they learned that Dr. Brunel had been arrested. By that time, they didn't know it, but the police had already questioned some of the women whose names were found in Brunel's files, and among them was a woman who had been referred by Reverend Bob Hare, who was a Presbyterian minister in Cleveland. Wheelwright advised all the Cleveland CCS clergy to warn the women they had sent to Massachusetts that they might be contacted by the police. Bob Hare had 5 women he had referred to Brunel on his list. So just to quote Bob Hare, 1, 2, 3, 4, they were appreciative, said if they got visited, they'd stand on their rights. Number 5 said they were here. The police had already been there the evening before. That's the end of the quote from Bob Hare. She was a young school teacher who lived at home, taught at the school where she had grown up, and was engaged to be married. Hare had counseled her and her fiance. They had been worried about the effect a pregnancy would have on her relationship with her family and her career as a teacher, because of course at that time that was a problem if you were pregnant. When Hare heard the women had already talked with the police, he sought an attorney. As Hare remembered it, the attorney told him not to worry, that Brunel was in trouble, but that the woman happened to learn of him through Hare was ancillary and probably of no interest to a prosecutor. But that evaluation proved to be optimistic. At 7 o'clock the next morning, Hare recalled, his home phone rang. It was the Associated Press asking, and this is a quote from Hare, asking, "Will you confirm for us that you've been criminally indicted in the state of Massachusetts yesterday?" I said, "What?" I had not heard from any courts. I could hear the ticker tapes going in the newsroom. He said, "Well, it's on the wire service, you and Dr. Pierre Victor Brunel. Do you know Dr. Brunel?" I said, "No, literally, I did not know him." The reporter told Hare that the wire service story said that Hare and Brunel had been indicted on a unit indictment. In other words, the 2 men had been indicted as one for the crime performing an abortion. Hare called his attorney, who was both surprised and dismayed. As he recalled, the attorney told him, "We're in very deep trouble. A unit indictment is rare. We have a big choice to make fairly quickly. If we just let them do it, you're going to get arrested by the Ohio State Police on behalf of the Massachusetts police, and they're probably out looking for you now. So watch your step." Sure enough, wherever Hare went that day, people told him that police had been looking for him. Hare considered the alternatives: fight extradition to Massachusetts, which would be expensive and not necessarily successful, wait for police to arrive, probably at his home, to handcuff him and haul him off to jail, probably subject to a great deal of press coverage, or, as he decided to do, appear in court in Massachusetts voluntarily. Hare and his attorney flew to Boston and appeared before a judge in Middlesex County, Hare in a dark suit and clerical collar. So the unit indictment was dismissed and Brunel was convicted. Hare's charges were dismissed in spring of 1970, but in a clearly political move and an unusual move, the prosecutor appealed the dismissal and eventually re-indicted him. So the legal case dragged on until at last in early 1973, of course, Roe versus Wade made the case moot. So that was one. There was another case of a rabbi in Chicago who was indicted but never appeared in court. So there was really relatively little legal ramification from all of this. So the results of the Clergy Consultation Service, they had made hundreds of thousands of abortion referrals by 1973. And it didn't take them long to realize that referrals were valuable to doctors. So they began to negotiate lower prices and set very strict conditions for the doctors. And that was Arlene's doing. They became a real consumer advocacy group for patients. They also proved that outpatient abortion was safe. Until that time, legal therapeutic abortions had been performed in hospitals, and they involved an overnight or longer stay in hospital, which added a great deal to the expense. Of all the hundreds of thousands of abortions for which they made the referral, there was not a single death. When New York State legalized abortion in 1970, the Clergy Consultation Service invited a doctor they'd been using to come to New York and open an outpatient abortion clinic. The doctor, Hale Harvey, had received glowing reports from his patients. He was respectful and caring and provided many thoughtful niceties, such as putting pot holders on the cold stirrups of his exam table. When he and his associate Barbara Pyle set up the clinic in rented offices in New York, they put up art and generally tried to make the setting more homey and comfortable. An innovative idea at the time. It became a model for other outpatient abortion clinics that followed. The clinic, Women's Services, opened on July 1st, 1970, the very day the new law took effect in New York State. And they did their abortions if needed for $25 if people couldn't afford, because and a lot of women came from across the country to come to that clinic. In 1972, the clinic's then medical director was Dr. Bernard Nathanson, a name some of you might recognize because he later became a vigorous anti-abortion activist and narrated the film Silent Scream. But in 1972, he was the director of Women's Services, and he published a study in the New England Journal of Medicine showing the safety of 26,000 outpatient abortions performed at the clinic. Today, not only abortion, but many, many surgical procedures are done on an outpatient basis. Knee surgery, gallbladder surgery, vasectomy, and that outpatient surgical revolution was really led by outpatient abortion clinics. The New England Journal study came out, by the way, just a few months before Supreme Court Justice Harry Blackmun wrote the Roe versus Wade decision at the Mayo Clinic Library. He had been the legal counsel for the Mayo Clinic in his previous career. We can't help thinking that he must have taken the study's conclusions into account as he wrote that opinion. And as DA mentioned, the CCS was also an advocacy group. They were really uniquely placed to offer statistics on thousands of cases. They testified in many state legislatures, and their clergy status allowed them to counterbalance the Roman Catholic clergy, who were really the most vocal opponents of abortion law reform at that time. Of course, there was a problem with that. They were heard as authoritative, not just because they had statistics and clerical status, but because most of them were white men with privileged social standing. Women, including organized feminist groups, were often excluded from or silenced in legislative hearings, as unfortunately we have been even recently. Nonetheless, the clergy used their privilege to tell the stories of women who could not speak for themselves because of the tremendous stigmas surrounding abortion. So I'm going to pass back to DA to conclude with sort of what we take from all of this.
I'll try to whip through this quickly so we have some time for questions. So the legacies of the Clergy Consultation Service were advocacy groups, in particular the advocacy group Religious Coalition for Abortion Rights, RCAR. And many clergy also testified against the Hyde Amendment, which limited Medicaid funding for abortion. In 1993, that group broadened its scope and became the Religious Coalition for Reproductive Choice, or RCRC. And 5 years later, it formed a clergy advisory committee to coordinate a nationwide Clergy for Choice network. And so there's also the legacy of counseling. Many of the CCS members felt like the counseling that they did sort of revived an interest in pastoral counseling. It empowered women who had the choice to go and seek the counseling and then make a choice for themselves. And a lot of ministers, Moody said, that came on board, quote, told me that it was the most meaningful part of the ministry that they ever had. And in fact, many did go on to counseling careers post CCS because they found the work so powerful and meaningful. So the clergy that we met went on and had full lives and careers after this work. Many of them continued to do social justice, racial justice, LGBTQ plus rights justice work in their own communities. We could, if you want to have a look at our book, you can see what the kind of work that they did and the legacy that they left. And in particular, Moody and Carmen went on to do work with sex workers in New York City, supported AIDS, people living with HIV and AIDS during the AIDS crisis era. Like Carmen and Moody continued to do meaningful work out of Judson around all kinds of social justice, racial justice work in the 70s, 80s, and into their death and retirement. They were active people. So what can we learn as activists from this? Well, we know that we're living through challenging times, particularly around the issue of access to abortion. I don't know if folks have been paying attention to the terrible things going on, particularly in Texas. Texas has banned virtually all abortions after the 6th week of pregnancy. It's now trying to pass a law that if you suspect a Texan is seeking to obtain an abortion after the 6th week, not only would you be able to sue the provider to try to stop it, but if you succeed, you're also entitled to compensation. The law known as SB 8 effectively enlists the citizenry, I'm quoting from the New York Times, to act as an anti-abortion Stasi. So terrifying and terrible things continue to go on. And when many of the clergy that we spoke to from the CCS said that they would do it all over again. And they, even though many of them are quite elderly, would be called back into action to provide the service again if so needed, if Roe v. Wade was overturned. So what is the legacy for activists today? Well, in particular, the service demonstrated the value of what we would call either allyship or being an accomplice or a co-conspirator, right? These white middle-class clergy were not themselves needing or seeking abortions, but they used their privilege in order to advocate for women who were often poor, women of color, and Black women in order to access abortions. Here I take the minute to mention the great Reverend Carl Bealby, who recently passed away, who from the Michigan CCS was able to teach a gynecologist how to perform an abortion. And so these individuals worked to build a coalition across movements as well, right? Which is an important thing for us who want to do this kind of intersectional work, to keep in mind that we need to stand with Black Lives Matter and queer rights and activism, as well as feminism, right? So that we are working collaboratively and intersectionality across our issues in order to strengthen liberatory movements everywhere, I guess is how I would put it. And that we need to be putting ourselves on the line in order to protect the rights of those who are most marginalized. So again, as people face abuse and arrest, as the clergy did, so should we in order to advance civil rights, human rights, and racial justice in our communities. That's what I'm going to say about that. Turning it over to you for any questions. And I did see there was one question about the statement, the clergy statement on abortion law reform is in Appendix A of our book. It is published in the book if you want to have a look at it. So that was one question I saw in the chat.
Yeah, I wonder, Karen, if you want to unmute and actually restate the question that you just put in the chat. I think it's a good one.
Okay, first, thank you. What a fascinating presentation. And I cannot wait to get my hands on this book. And thank you for all the effort you put into it. I was struck at the beginning with the quote about how the name came about, compassion. The very first part of the quote was not to encourage abortion. And to me, because I'm highly focused on stigma, that has a sting of, we think, you know, we shouldn't encourage it because it's not good, but we're going to be compassionate for people who need it. And it seems the efforts were rooted in preventing tragedies and deaths, which was excellent at that time. But were there any preachers who came out boldly and spoke about in their congregations about abortions as a moral good for individuals, families, and communities?
I would say that it varied among the clergy, and that initial statement that they put out had to be acceptable to all 21 of the original people the original clergy members who were listed. They were listed by name in that New York Times article. And the statement that they put out at the time had to be acceptable to all of them. That is not, to me, that has no ring of what, for example, Howard Moody would ever have, the way Howard Moody would ever have talked about abortion. He talked about it completely as something that women needed. And he wanted to step out of the way. He didn't want, when he was asked actually later by the New York State legislature was creating its new law, whether there should be a requirement for women to be counseled before they were approved for an abortion. He said, absolutely not. I don't want to have anything to do with this. It was only a matter of expediency that we had to be participating in this at all, that it shouldn't be that kind of a thing. So for the most part, I would say most of them wouldn't have spoken about it that way. There probably were some outspoken people in that first group that wanted that phraseology in there.
Thanks for that question.
That's just my speculation, but nobody, we didn't actually talk to anybody who spoke of it in that way.
Thanks for answering that. I do see another question that Judy put in there, wondering if you know anything about women clergy being today involved in reproductive rights activism, and if you want to share anything that you know about that.
I'd just like to say that the current chief of head of staff at Judson Memorial Church in New York City is a woman who was, as a seminarian, a part of the Clergy Consultation Service in Chicago. And she and many other, now there are so many more women clergy, and many women clergy are parts of RCRC. I dare say RCRC now is probably 80% women. I don't know. I haven't looked at their membership list, but if you go to clergy protests or support events, many of the clergy are women, and we know many of them. So yes, there are lots of women clergy involved in abortion rights now. DA, did you have additional things?
Are there any other questions? One final question, anyone? Oh, I think I see you speaking, Donna, but you're muted.
Okay, could you just repeat the title of your book again? Book again? Thank you. Thank you.
It's called To Offer Compassion.
Okay,
a
got it.
history of the Clergy Consultation Service on abortion. And we have a website that's just tooffercompassion.com.
Okay, thank you.
Or go to University of Wisconsin Press to find out more about it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wow.
And we should say we joked a little bit about Louise Hanovan, Pat's daughter, and the musical production that she would like to write called just Arlene ! That Arlene Carmen, the personage of Arlene Carmen was featured in the HBO series The Deuce, because it's set in New York City during the late 60s and early 70s. And so she's not a central character, but, you know, it's about sex work. And so there's some, you know, a little bit of Arlene Carmen, the character in there. We've been approached by both a documentary film group and a fictional film writer about trying to see if the history of the CCS or some of this information can be more broadly made public in a film way, but I guess Hollywood is complicated, and so some of these things have stalled out. We would love to see some form of either a documentary or a fictionalized story of the CCS out in the world, but we are not Hollywood producers, so TBD if that will happen in future.
Well, I just want to thank both of you, DA and Pat, for sharing this history with us today and for introducing folks to Arlene Carmen in particular. I have to say, I've been reading the book and it's really a joy. And so thank you so much for helping us learn about critical history. And for me, I had never really made the connection for some reason between the CCS and present day faith-based abortion advocacy. And it really seems like it provided this incredible foundation that we continue to, grow and need today. So I'm just so grateful that you took all those years to make this history and document it for us. Thank you for sharing it with us today. And thank you to all of you for being here with GER. We're really grateful and it's been lovely.
Thank you.
So
Thank
much.
you. Thank you.
Thank
Have
you
a
all
good
so
one.
much. It was an honor to be asked. We love talking about Arlene and everyone.
Yeah, thank you so much. We would talk forever about this, so we're amazing. We kept it to an hour, so thank you.
Keep us posted on the musical. So, all right. Bye, everyone. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you all.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.